folks. My name is Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. Pleased today to be talking about creating corporate communications handoffs from the boardroom to the front lines to make sure that narratives are consistent and crises can be avoided. And I'm joined here by people who have lots of corporate experience because I don't have any. So we have Roberto, Kateryna, and Jen. And if you all can introduce yourselves very briefly.
Happy to. Dustin, thanks for having us. Excited to talk about this and share what we know and what we've experienced. To everyone, I'm Jen Becker. Spent more years than I care to admit leading internal and external comms for Fortune 500 companies. I now run my own consulting business, focusing primarily on internal communications, team building, and a specialization in crises, because I've spent a lot of my career of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I guess the best thing to share is what my mantra is and why I've switched more to focusing on internal communications is that I live by the mantra of always tell employees first. They are your most important audience.
And Kateryna, how about yourself?
Yeah, hi Dustin, hi colleagues, and thank you for having me. So I spent over 15 years building internal communications and corporate culture functions in large organizations. For example, one of them had 350,000 employees, and almost all of those organizations were in the period of big transformation. And in every case, my role wasn't just to inform employees, it was to make sure that strategy actually translated into daily behavior. So the focus was on shaping employees' behavior according to business goals.
And Roberto.
Hey, and Roberto here. I've been in communications for about 20 years now. And I've worked for HSBC, Tesco. I've worked for Edelman. I've worked for Weber. I've started rowing my own canoe about 2 years ago, doing my own consultancy. And my focus has been around moments of change and transformation and a lot around purpose, mission, values, and narrative. Because I find that those are the most important strategic elements for people to and organizations to center themselves on, or else they're untethered. And so I think I can bring that conversation to light here, but also nice to be with you all, and thanks for having me.
Now, one thing you all said in our emails and our prep call, and Kateryna and Roberto, you both hinted at this, is that it's not just strategy. It's not just something the boardroom, everyone talks about, and then it'll kind of everything magically, goes downstream to internal and external audiences. One of the things that Jen mentioned, and this is validated by Gallup, is that 41% of employees are stressed, 34% of employees are thriving in their overall well-being. There's very little workplace engagement, employee engagement in the workplace, and it's been going down for a lot of years. RTO, of course, impacts that. Values being maybe in conflict, but also just a lack of communication from the top all the way to the front lines. And similarly, PwC's 2024 Trust Survey found that there's a lot of employees and consumers who just don't trust corporations. Business executives think 90% of business executives think that customers highly trust their companies, but only 30% of consumers actually do. And that grew between 2022 and 2023. So I'd like, Jen, can you talk a little bit about why you think those disconnects are happening with internal and external audiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen it and I've lived it. I think first and foremost, I said it's always tell employees first, but the other thing, and I learned this in crisis communications, is always tell the truth. Employees can handle it. And I think there's a lot of leaders, and I'm speaking very, broadly here,
Sure.
are afraid to tell the truth sometimes. They either don't want to admit they don't know something or that there is ambiguity. They want to come out with very clear, certain things. This is how things are. And when that doesn't happen, because, as we're going through different transformations, things happen. When it doesn't happen the way leaders promised it was going to, that's going to erode trust. So I think a lot of it is coming from the fact that leaders, trust is a two-way street. So the leaders need to trust the employees that they can handle the tough messages, they can handle the truth. Ironically, we had a few good men on the other day. So actually, I was hearing Jack Nicholson do, "You can't handle the truth." Uh, but
Sure.
employees can handle the truth. And I think that's one of the best lessons leaders can have is to be honest and upfront with their employees about what situations are happening, how the business is doing, what a transformation could mean, and most importantly, that they might not have all the answers at this time, but when we have them, we're going to share them with you. And then they do share those answers when they have them. That's what builds trust because then employees see leaders as they're in it with them. And I think that's where some of the trust has gone away is that belief that you have to know everything.
Now, Roberto, I think you're nodding a lot. Is it that leaders think they should know everything versus being able to communicate more transparently? What are you nodding most about?
Well, I also think there's like there is a framework that I think exists around this, which is
Mhm.
you go back to you go back to purpose, you go back to mission, you go back to values. And the reason I say that a lot is that that becomes your Rosetta Stone of
Yep.
how you consistently show up as an organization and as a leader. And if
Mhm.
those are off, the way in which you respond in a crisis or any problem is going to be off as well. And
Mhm.
so I think like stress testing those with business leaders and with stakeholders is so essential. But also you've got to make sure that they're resilient and that when you ask the question of how do we show up in this situation? If we say transparency is one of our values, you've
Right.
got to be transparent, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
that's what your code is, right? If you have
Right.
a friend who says I'm transparent and then they're not, you're not going to be friends with them if they keep lying to you, right? And so I think about brands like People in that way, in a very similar way, that as you show up to your employees or as you show up to external audiences, you've got to make sure that your Rosetta Stone is sound and that you also not just have that strategically set, but you've got the process around making sure that it doesn't go awry. And what I mean by that is that when it gets tested, that the closest person to the CEO doesn't make the decision. You've got a process that's in place in order to make sure that it's every single moment has been thought about in the right way of who's sitting in the room, who's making the decision, how do we make that decision, and that we've got a few decisions that we want to make and all across the spectrum, and that we know what those are going to be. Otherwise, I do think that you can literally get messed up with strategy and process not being aligned. And I think those are really important to define early.
Well, and Kateryna, you said that in your opening comments that it wasn't just strategy that you helped companies that have several 100,000 employees think about. It was also the execution, the thread for the entire organization. How were you involved in creating those threads to Roberto's last point?
Yeah, so actually, the first thing I want to point your attention is that we need to understand the difference between satisfied and engaged employees. And actually, because employee who is satisfied, it doesn't mean that they are engaged at the same time. And the biggest problem for companies are employees who actually are satisfied, but not engaged. Because it means that employee who likes everything, who is satisfied with his company, with his employer, it's everything okay for him, but they doesn't want to make an effort. And those employees are actually our ballast, because they don't want to change anything. And it's a big problem for companies. And I think that's, so I do agree with colleagues, with Roberto and Jen, but I think that every company has different problems. And answering your questions about how to translate the strategy into behavior, I think the most important thing is that we don't need just translate the strategy into messages directly. Before, we need to make a very important step. We need to translate this strategy into behavior. We need to understand what do we want our employees do? What does it mean for different functions? What kind of behavior we want them employees to translate and so on. So it is the step number one. We need to translate the strategy into exactly behavior we need from employees for every function, because every function needs absolutely different things.
Actually, I'd love to build on that. I think that's a great point, and it goes back to, it's know your audience. So know your employee audience. So, we've always thought about that from an external standpoint, whether it was, traditional media,
Mhm.
we're going out for a speaking engagement, but when it comes to employees, understanding the difference of manufacturing workers to people who are working customer service to sales folks out in the fields to the people who are in the office, say in the supporting functions, they all look at things a little bit different way and experience the company differently. So understanding those nuances and what's important to those audiences is the first step in connecting with them. And they're not going to become engaged until you connect with them. You have to show that you
Absolutely.
understand them.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And about profiling our audience, about understanding our audience, I think it's essential to know that we can do two different analysis. So first of all, is profiling audience based on HR data, like who are our employees, and we need to know everything about them. And the second one, we need to analyze their motivation and barriers through like surveys, focus groups, and so on. We need to ask them what motivates them, what frustrates them, and so on. And I do agree with Jane that as deeply we understand our audience, as better our communication campaigns. And also we need to create targeted communication, because absolutely, like what Jen noticed, that they understand information in different ways. They have different perception of information. And that is why segmentation is our everything. So we need to segment, yeah.
Sure, of course. Now, one of the things that I keyed in on, I think it was something Jen said, but a few weeks ago, we had a panel discussion around when the strength of say a charismatic leader, and the crisis with them is if they make a mistake, but also what if they leave? Something as simple as they take another job and then they take 250,000 social media followers with them. When we talk about leadership disconnect, Roberto, how often is it by intention or arrogance or personality flaws versus simply not understanding what Kateryna just laid out about segmentation, about surveys and other things, of the complexities of running a large organization and keeping a not just employee, what was it you said, Kateryna, employee satisfaction high, but also employee engagement. Where do you find the most common disconnect from leadership?
I mean, leaders are trusted, right? Like CEOs are trusted pretty much to the organization. Like the stats do show that generally that a leader is actually, in terms of all of society, that they're one of the most trusted figures in your life. A manager is much more trusted in an employee engagement
Yes.
perspective. And
Oh,
that's something that should not be lost in this conversation, because the way in which to share anything should go through a manager and make sure that they have all the tools and the training. But a CEO is trusted. I do think there's danger in creating a sort of sycophant CEO leader that you've got, that if they do leave, that the whole house of cards
Mhm.
falls down. Because
Mhm.
if you do that, then you're actually putting all of your equity as a communications person or as an organization into one person.
Mhm.
And that's not sustainable. So you've got to have a strong bench strength of people that are able to show up consistently, but also back to morals and values and principles, that it's not just something that's held by just a few people, but it's actually held across the organization. That's incredibly important. But like CEOs are changing at a rapid rate right now. They're changing like every 2 years, and CCOs are, and CMOs are. And so to
Mhm.
not look at that reality of where we are is to not being paying attention to what's actually happening in the marketplace. And so we do, as communicators, need to plan for the fact that we've got to spread the equity of how you show
Mhm.
up as an industry and as a company across
Right.
a broader swath of people, which is why I go back to, again, go to the Rosetta Stone. Don't just go to a couple of personalities that are going to like hold the whole thing together,
Mhm.
because if they leave, which inevitably they will based on the current environment, you might actually be in a place that you're going to be in a difficult situation as a communicator. And also, you might not be there in a year or two later, because the communications person generally leaves when the CEO leaves. So I think these are things that, as an industry, that we really, really need to stare at, because we put a lot this in the past 5 years in a different place than we are currently. Okay, Jen, you were nodding. I'd be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I think about my own career path. And so my first big Fortune 500 was Procter and Gamble, and it was John Pepper had come back as CEO. So think about, and that's, I'm thinking about that. And then went to AG Lafley, too, very high powered, well respected. I mean, people cried when John Pepper finally retired, for good. And he's still incredibly, revered throughout, throughout the business world and throughout the communities that P&G exists in. And then when I moved to USAA, we truly had a rock star CEO. I mean, one of the most, probably the most beloved CEO I've ever seen from an employee standpoint. I mean, we referred to Joe as a rock star. And it was because he related to the employees so much. And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about, Roberto, when you were talking, when they left, there was this really interesting dip that happened. It was kind of like, it's kind of like following up Tom Brady for the New England Patriots. You don't ever want to be that
I'm
person
for New
following.
Hampshire. Yep. Even
Yeah.
though it's Bill Belichick left right after
Yeah,
that.
exactly. You don't want
Too
to
long after.
we're Florida
Yep.
Gators when Steve Spurrier
Yep.
left. Nobody wants to follow in those footsteps. So there
Right.
is definite danger around building around that personality of CEO. And then when I think about it from another standpoint, from a crisis, when you look at like today's current environment, let's say just how the polarization of say an Elon Musk and what that can do for a business. When it's
Right.
around a personality, when you think about Steve Jobs or Bill Gates,
Or
those
Howard
it's
Schultz at Starbucks. Like no
exactly.
CEO that he seems to be able to run the ship.
Exactly. When you think, oh God, Lee Iacocca back in the 80s with
Yep.
Chrysler, those were very personality driven. And what I've seen is where the most success is yes, the CEO is still recognized and highly trusted. But it is that entire, whether you call it an executive council, the leadership team, whatever the name is that a corporation is, it is, as Roberto said, it is spread across it. And they are aligned and in step with one another. The messaging is consistent. The
Mhm.
purpose and the culture is consistent. They speak as one. No one necessarily greater than the other. I like it. I think you saw Dustin in one of our responses is I call it, it's kind of like parenting. They may disagree behind closed
Yep.
doors,
Yep.
but they are a
Mhm.
unified front for the
Yep.
employees. And the employees know that they are in it together. They are working towards the same purpose and the same goals. They support one another, which means the organization and the different sections of organizations and different departments support one another. It builds a lot of trust and a lot of faith. Kids feel better when they think, they know their parents get along, and if they go to mom and they go to dad, they're going to get the same
Good
answer.
same answer.
So
Yes.
there's a lot. I hadn't thought about how much I personally had experienced that kind of cult of personality CEO and the drop off that happens and the risks that are associated with that.
Um, I want to tell that I will respectively disagree because I think it's this it depends on industry probably, because Roberta worked for like tech companies and Jenny worked for FMCG companies, and they worked mostly for like heavy industries, for oil and gas, metallurgical companies and so on. And in those reality where you have like 80% of deskless employees, they can even like mostly they don't know even the name of the CEO, and it is a big problem. Moreover, we have research of WorkVivo, and it says that, I don't remember for sure the number, but I think that it's around 60% of employees don't trust their CEO. So yeah, so actually I was surprised when Roberta, when you told that there is no problem and the CEO usually are trusted. In my experience, it's not like this, and especially in heavy industries, you need to work a lot building this trust, because of course when you have this trust, you will receive much better performance and results for the company. But in my point of view, it's still a big problem now for a lot of companies.
I could see that. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. And one of the things that I recognized in CPG and manufacturing is it's not that they didn't trust the CEO. They knew the name, but the CEO didn't matter that much to them. What mattered more to them were their direct managers, their
Exactly.
plant managers. And to them, the company, it was their plant. It was the town that they're in. It was that 400, 500, 1,000 people that work there, not the other 40 or 50,000. They knew that was important and they knew it was there, but to them it was very much insular and more personal. So that was the leadership that mattered the most to them.
So
And the CEO stat is more around CEOs being trusted in society. Edelman just did a really good study around this. Well, always the trust barometer, but it
oh,
was
sure.
right. So, but it was more around, but it's diminishing. But they're more than politicians. They're more than like
Right.
other historical figures that exist in society. So there was this moment in the past few years to put the onus on the CEO to be responsible for being in charge of how people responded, not just within the organization, but within societal norms. And I
Yeah.
think that's a really interesting question now of how much responsibility in a capitalist societies exist upon a CEO to make sure that their employees are happy where they are, or should they leave? And I think that's a really interesting question that's happening right now when you actually, before it was make them stick. And now I think there's a question of, well, is that my responsibility? And I don't necessarily have an opinion around it as much as I think that it's an interesting thing that's happening around societal norms of companies and as business leaders, if that makes sense.
Well, so one of the things, again, the biggest organization I've ever worked for, I think had about 15 employees. So I've never been in this corporate environment, but everything I've heard anecdotally, my wife has worked in the military. She's been at several hospitals. She always sings the praises of her immediate manager, even if she doesn't love the way the business person who knows nothing about healthcare runs the hospital. I've heard this in the military. There's a variation on that there. You see voters hate Congress but love their congressman, congresswoman,
Right.
senator. Um, so when it comes to bringing it down, Sam Reel with Boston and Cedar describes that when you're growing a company, it's really about getting those middle managers in place who can really execute so the founder can focus on the growth. And it sounds like it's also true when you're at scale,
Oh, yeah.
trying to bring the river down. Is that a fair interpretation?
Absolutely. In fact, it might even be more important when you're
Yeah.
at that kind of pinnacle and that top because it is so easy. Because once you start to fall and once the trust erodes in that middle sector, Roberto brought it up earlier. It's empowering those people and giving them the tools to communicate. Having led internal comms, what we did was important, the big messages that went out. But the most important thing I think about it that we would create were the toolkits and the different mechanisms so that team leaders and managers could communicate directly to their employees, to their teams. It was much more powerful sitting in a 7 to 8 person team, hearing it directly from your manager. They're answering the questions. They have the information that they need because you know that person. You have a personal relationship with them. So you're
Right.
much more likely to go to them with the questions than you're not going to go to you're not going to go to the head of internal comms. You're not going to go to the person that's 3 levels ahead of you. You're going to be the person who you know. That's who you're going to. So having them have the tools and the skills that they need to communicate with their team is, to me, that's really where the make or break comes in internal comms, particularly in big organizations.
Now, Kateryna, along those lines, one of the notes I took from our conversation before our prep call was kind of just delineating between the HR people, the operations people, the financial people. But it sounds like this is might be even more minutia than that, more micro than that, I should say, where it's by location, it's everyone in your town or everyone in your specific team. So, Kateryna, how do you let's kind of dive now into the comms strategy side. How do you get the CEO to recognize that what they say is good, but it's way more important to create that thread so there's that consistency all the way down from the board to those individual teams? And then I'd also like you to describe how you create that structure, those processes to go from that high all the way down to each level of management.
Yeah, it depends on the company, of course. And I do agree with Jen that she mentioned before that we need to understand our audience and we need to segment them. And for example, in my experience, we targeted, yes, on like location, level, and functions and so on, because different groups of employees, they understand the information in different ways. And one message, like one idea, can have absolutely different messages. And yeah, we had a like metric system where we understand where we can understand which channel for which group will work for each for which message.
And Roberto, I'd like to hear your response to the same question.
Yeah, I mean, like I think managers are the most squeezed people in an organization, right? Like you get all of the pressure of everything on your shoulders as a
Top
manager.
and coming the other way.
Yeah, like and you're literally like feeling it from every day. And also they're the people that are like, if you look at any employee engagement surveys traditionally across bigger organizations, they're the people that are most dissatisfied because they've got well, like any organization I've been with, any other study I've read, and tell me if I'm wrong, if other people have said it, read otherwise.
That was I'm curious and listening. Look, that wasn't my challenging you.
No. But the reason I say that too, though, is that it kind of makes sense if you intuitively think about it, right? Like you're the person that's digesting the information, trying to take on a strategy, and then deploying it across an organization. But you're getting the feedback, and then you're trying to give it back to leaders. You're kind of stuck in this middle ground. I think Jen's point, sorry, Jen, is a really important one. That as communicators, we're not fully responsible for the organization communicating. Like everyone is a communicator. I promise you, if you open your job description, it's inside of it. But what we can
Everything is
do,
sales and everything is communication. Yes.
right. But what we can do is to create templates and frameworks and toolkits to help to accelerate that conversation and take a little bit of the weight off their shoulders and to give them the ability to be able to show up of like, what are the 5 things I need to say today that's going to make my team go faster? What are the things that I need to worry about today that's going to make my manager happier, right? And I think as communicators, if we stop thinking about being responsible for everyone being able to communicate, but actually think about how do we give templates, tools, strategic enablers to people to be able to do their jobs better, we'd be a much more effective function in lots of ways. But also for that manager population, you would give them a gift if you could do it really well, where it's actually the 5 things you want to say, not the 5 things that corporate wants you to say out loud. And so I just think there's like a reframing sometimes around how we are able to really lift the pressure off their shoulders in meaningful ways.
Yeah, and I also want to add that, yeah, I do agree that managers is one of the most important actually communication channels that we have, and we need to understand that they are our channel, yeah. But we also need to remember about pressure, and we don't need to over pressure because they have like incredible, like a lot of things they need to do all the time. And when we give them toolkits, it's good, but we don't need to give them like over toolkits.
I agree. It's make it as easy as possible for them. It's to keep it simple. You know, these are the 3 to 4 things that you need to remember. Here's the most likely questions you are going to get. If you have to send an email, here's a template, fill in the name, fill in the date, make it easy for them. But again, don't overload them and make it too much that they're doing all of the communicating. They're one channel, a very, very important one.
Yeah, we need to be we need to help them. We don't need to be their problem or additional things that they don't want to do.
Yeah, you don't want them groaning when they hear from you. So
exactly. Then they'll just delete it next time.
Well,
yeah.
But we've talked for the last 25 minutes primarily about internal audiences. Let's pivot now to external. You know, there's consumers have more options now than ever before, and more access to those options than ever before. Brand loyalty is probably a questionable concept for most companies these days. How do, what's the greatest challenge in ensuring that what is being said at the board level is reaching those consumers? What's the biggest barrier to make it to trying to reach at least that core audience? And Starbucks ran into this problem last year with the now former CEO was trying to defend the bad quarter they had. And the way he did it was to argue that it was bad weather, a slow app, And there was a third fact that's escaping me. And Howard Schultz came out with a statement disagreeing with that and saying, well, you guys have tried to go across too many not core audience, not core purchasers, instead of focusing really narrowly on the people who are your most frequent buyers. And so there seemed to be a communications gap there between
Yeah.
leadership and buyer.
Yeah, I could see, I mean, external, and I guess I was really fortunate to grow up at P&G where it was so much about knowing the consumer. I mean, we named them and every letter of their name meant something. So you knew, I worked on Pringles before, when P&G still owned Pringles, and we knew exactly who our consumer was. We knew who she was. We knew, this is dating myself, we knew what song was on her alarm clock when it went off at 6 a.m. I mean, we
Wow.
knew, they delved that much into it with market research to understand them. And you were very much about the core. It didn't mean that there weren't other people who bought the product, but this was like 60 to 70% of the product was going to be, this was the decision maker. And knowing who those decision makers are, knowing them. So it's what Kateryna was talking about with employee research. I
Mhm.
just think there's a lot of companies that were doing it for consumers, and now we're starting to see that we've got to do it for employees as
Oh,
well.
Yeah.
So but I think is what's happening now is the consumer mindset has changed. Like you said, brand loyalty, I don't want to say it's dead, but it's definitely not, it's not what it was in the 80s and 90s at
well,
all.
I was 5 at the end of the 80s, so I'll take your word on that one. But
I wasn't. So, um, but I think with consumers, it comes back to knowing them and understanding them and knowing that it has changed dramatically. The diversity within the consumer culture, I think, is immense because there are so many choices now. I mean, just look, what was it? I just think I saw this past quarter that streaming beat all of the major networks
yes.
in ratings for
Hmm.
the first time. So
Yep.
think about the fact that, I can go and I can do Netflix, I can do Hulu, I can do you, all of those I can do. I can't tell you the last time I watched one of, purposely turned on one of the major networks, like, oh, I got to get this from that.
Unless it's for
And
the
I think
Super Bowl.
that's
But even that's being an Amazon thing now.
exactly. So if you look at that,
So,
there are so many different ways to reach this. I've actually feel for companies because it's going to be such a challenge going forward, of how to reach people. And I don't feel like you have the homogeny we once had.
No.
That's both a good thing and a bad thing. More choices for consumers, more venues out there. This is a bigger challenge and a harder nut to crack for corporations.
Can I jump on that? Because I think that's a really interesting thread. Like more people are spending time alone now than they were before the pandemic.
Hmm.
More people are eating by themselves than before the pandemic. More people are ignoring news
Hmm.
right now than they were before. So you've got
mhm.
this like, and then you add an echo chamber and then you add social media on top of it. So as communicators, it's really hard of how you reach someone, but also you've got a consumer that's self-isolating in lots of ways, or also like, but then maybe in different ways, they're looking for like joy in different ways. The frictionless thing that makes their life easier makes them happier. The
Hmm.
the transaction that did it faster than it before makes them more excited than they were the minute they were not doing that. So like I think there's insight in knowing where the consumer is, but also like so that's like a consumer insight. But as a communicator, we've also got to understand it's an echo chamber. It's totally fragmented. The way to
Hmm.
reach people before is not the New York Times above the fold
Right.
moment. It's
No.
the influencer that exists in a really
Mhm.
different way than would be the Kanye West. It's the person you've never heard of before.
Right.
So, but
Right.
I just think that like, so we've got to like apply the logic of not just what's happening from a consumer persona, but from an
Mhm.
audience
I
persona
agree.
onto the way in which we're showing up externally and internally to your point earlier on internal comms. But like, it's so fragmented that it requires a surgeon's knives, not a hammer. And I
Yeah.
think that we before had a really easier way to say like
Mhm.
get this thing and it'll cut through. Where now you need a really multifaceted approach to be able to reach people in a much more intricate, diverse way.
Yeah, to build on that, and because then to take into another thing, the lack of attention span. I have two teenage sons.
Uh,
Um, the attention
Sure.
span is not there. The phone is everything. And my husband's a high school teacher. The number of kids, when you ask them what do they want to be when they grow up, they want to be an influencer. That's what they want to be. They want to be an Instagram
Right.
influencer. That is their goal.
Of
I
course.
find that frightening and fascinating at the same time. So, like you said, and so who it's influencing, it's not Taylor Swift or Kanye West
Right.
necessarily. It's not LeBron. It's not uh it's like you said, it's somebody we don't even know that they exist, but right now they're getting hot. And how you tap into that, not to mention just the continual evolution of that network and that framework. And we were talking 10 years ago, what's going to be the next social media channel? What's going to be the next thing hot to hit?
Right.
And we're still there. So um I'm beginning to think I went to switch more to internal because it's maybe a little bit safer. So
Well, let's talk about that safety factor because, as a PR guy, there's always that fine line between a fake crisis and a real one. I always talk about the Trader Joe's survey in 2020. Some college student got 120 signatures on a change.com or whatever that website is for the petitions, got 120 signatures, but it came at the time of the racial protests. So it made briefly national news. And Trader Joe's said, no, we listen to our customers about our food names and whatnot. We're not going to change because some random petition. That was a crisis that they kind of headed off. Five Guys regularly gets criticized for the cost of their food. And I actually wrote a piece. I don't think they responded at all to a semi-viral receipt screenshot or photo that went online. And then, of course, you have what's his name, Brian Nickel, the new CEO of Starbucks. When he was brand new, there was just all these headlines about is he violating the return to office policy and everything else. Where's the line, Kateryna, between responding to those crises and making sure that you take their temperature, rather going to impact internal and external audiences, versus when you have this kind of fast-paced environment and tens or hundreds of thousands of employees and millions of customers, you're always going to have somebody who's not happy and not engaged.
Yeah, and it is normal that we have somebody who is not
Right.
happy and not engaged. And I can tell you more that if you're talking about internal communications and like best practices, if we have 20% of employees who are both engaged and satisfied, it is absolutely enough for the company to be successful.
You say
So
10%?
20,
20, excuse me.
20% if
Okay.
they're both satisfied and engaged at the same time. It's a good result, actually. And about this line, I think that I don't have an answer, because I think that in our fast-moving world, I think that nobody knows where is this line. And what we are talking about now is that everything is changing, and even we consume information in different way. And what Jen mentioned about brand loyalty, actually I graduated Johns Hopkins just 1 month ago, and we discussed researches, and one of research demonstrates exactly that Jen mentioned that now we have a trend that we no more have this brand loyalty from consumers. So they trust to like small influencers rather than big brands. And because of that, we need to understand that every our word and message and picture and everything influence perception in the way that sometimes we even can't imagine how it will be. So if we're talking about employees, we need to measure this temperature that you mentioned. And in my experience working for large organizations, usually we know like where probably we will have a problem, and we want to manage this problem before it will be like external crisis. It's a best way, but quite difficult to manage.
Did I just freeze? I apologize. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Can I add to that? Because there was a moment where we know what the Supreme Court cases in the United States, very US centric, but what they might be coming up. I think we're now in a much more complicated place, because you kind of don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next.
Right.
But there was a moment where you're like, okay, Roe versus Wade is on the docket.
Mhm.
And okay, we probably won't be out there publicly talking about what it means for our organization, depending on what your organization is. But you
Mhm.
do need to talk to your employees about that
Hmm.
Yes.
because there are policy consequences that you need to know. But so you could wait until the moment that that Supreme Court case was given to you and then leave your grocery store and then have to go figure it out, right? Or you could be thinking about it enough to be like, there are certain things that are coming up. These things follow our values, these things follow our policies, these things are things
Right.
that we need to be thinking about. And here's the hit team that sits against each one of those.
Hmm.
And then actually like put a framework together that becomes your corporate responsibility framework that's like, hey, these things, we don't sell guns. Maybe if it's not inside of a place that we have employees, it's not a country that we have employees, we're not going to necessarily get involved.
Right.
If it's
Right.
a place, but if it's a place that we have employees that it impacts them, like so you actually can map out a bit of a framework
Hmm.
around these are the places that we're going to talk and that we're going to want to be. And but is it internal, external first? I think internal generally is the right answer. But who are the people that are involved in decision making around it? I implore like every company to think about it that way because I think that if you say we're not really going to know what's going to come up, that you also are going to be on the back foot immediately when you're having to respond to something incredibly serious that may come out wrong. But
Right.
there's a few territories that you know that you might need to go and have a conversation in, and putting the right people around that, I think, is incredibly important for any brand right now based on the situation that we're in.
Well, and
I,
two, along those lines, if I can just real quick, is the the need to say something about everything is incredibly damaging
hmm.
internally and externally because you get involved in something. Delta Airlines came out with a statement about voting reform, and they were involved in the issue. They said they made this a better law, and then the left said, "Oh my God, you're involved in Jim Crow 2.0." Then they backpedaled, and then the conservatives in the state of Georgia, where it's based, said, "No, no, no, now you're lying to everybody." They got so involved that they were totally unprepared. But to your point, Roberto, and one of the things I put up this week said it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to run silent. Then if someone asks, say, "I don't know. I'll get back to you if we need to." Because the
Yeah, and
more time
sometimes
you put
it's
yourself out
even
there,
more, sorry, and sometimes it's more important even if you don't have an answer. It's like,
right,
Don't
yeah,
right.
say anything.
There's no need to open the door and
yeah.
take a gun, point it at your foot
And shoot.
by putting something on social versus, to your point, maybe you just set up a newsletter and you have a couple of small things to communicate to the audience that need to know. Anyway,
Yeah.
that was a long rant. It's the first
Yeah.
time I've been able to actually add anything of value on this call.
No, it's okay. I was saying about that because there definitely was, and I think it's backed up. There was a period, and I think for about 5 or 6 years, where anytime something happened of social, political
Yes.
significance,
Yep.
either it was, a condemnation or we support, or of course our thoughts and prayers go out to
Right.
everybody. You had to do it. You had to
Right.
do this post. And I was, one of my clients was a small regional construction company that one, I can't, I think it was George Floyd. And I was like, they're like, do we need to put out a statement about that? I'm like, no, you don't have to put out. I mean,
Right.
if you want to talk to employees about that, or if people have different that's fine, but you don't need to put out a public statement about this. You're a construction company located in the US Southeast. You're fine. It's not a big deal. Not that it's not a big deal, but you putting out a statement isn't. I'm seeing it happening now with DEI. You're seeing the
Mhm.
companies that are coming out on both sides saying, some saying, we've completely eliminated our DEI programs. We're doing that. Target took a massive hit on that for the statements that they made. And I've seen other companies, one of my clients who's decided to take it very internal. They've had employees and are like, this is our stance. This is how we are going to do things. Not saying anything publicly, but they're being very upfront and transparent with their employees about these are our values, this is who we are, this is how we will continue to act. I think it's a little bit of the Me Too movement, as in a Me Too. Well, if our competitor said that and everybody else is saying that, we
Right.
can't miss out
Mhm.
because if we don't say something, then people are going to think we don't care about it or we don't know about it. And
Right.
I hate the term swim in your lane, but sometimes it really does apply here. Swim in your lane. You don't have to make a statement on everything.
Yes, and I also want to add that in a crisis, even we can actually gain trust because if we give an answer quite quickly, even when we don't have like a clear answer, but as Dustin, as you suggested, that we can just tell that like we will come back like in an hour with any information, we can gain trust from our like employees or customers, because we can demonstrate that we are trying to solve the problem and so on, and it is much better than make like just a silence.
Well, and two, back in 2017, when the United Airlines employee got beat up, I think the CEO blamed the customer the first 7 statements he made. Finally, statement number 8, he admitted, hey, maybe we were not entirely correct. I really thought at the time that was going to be a major hit to United for the long term. And I just last week, just for fun, I looked it up. They took a blip on their stock, and everyone moved forward. When Meta made their changes earlier this year, they were already heading in that direction. Of course, all the headlines were that they're going to destroy trust, but they had a really good first quarter earnings report. And so I do, again, I'm a PR guy, right? So I focus on external audiences. Where Roberto, you said internal is more important, you believe probably more important than external. And I think that makes sense. But again, there's no black white answer to the following question, but where's that line where you're a government contractor and maybe everyone who worked, having worked for you came under the Biden administration where you had to you were hiring under DEI policies in these ways. And now to gain a 100 million, 10 million, $1 billion contract, you have to go the complete other way just to survive as a company. How do you communicate those sorts of things while helping everyone understand, like, we have to have money as a company? So that was a long-winded question. I'm sorry.
Well, if your employees don't believe in you, then what are they doing every day? And so like for me, that's like you got to start from the center of the onion and you got to work your way out. Because if your employees are waking up every day, they don't know why they're there, they don't know what they're doing, and they don't believe in what they're there for, and they don't like you, they're going to leave. There's no loyalty, there's no strategy development, there's no approach to do something that's going to mean something towards the customer. I really believe in like Richard Branson approach of, he always says like put your employee first and your customer will follow. And a lot of people have a really interesting response to that. But I like that because I think that if your employee is outside saying that you're not doing a good job, they don't know what they're doing, but also they're not being able to follow your strategy, then how are you as an employer able to make sure that you're delivering for customers every single day? The other approach would be kind of the Amazon customer first, and everybody else falls around that, right? And I'm not saying that they're not doing a good job with their employee communications, but I've always been in the camp of get your employees to deeply believe in what you're doing, get them to be on your side, and to help them understand exactly why they're there, and they will take care of the rest of the things. And I know, man, I don't want to be
How's your
like a
communicators?
sycophant, like talking to myself, but then you really do see the magical ingredient of, I get it, versus I'm transactional, I'm leaving. And I think that that's right now where we are in the employee-employer relationship, that if you don't have that depth of loyalty and understanding, that you could lose a lot of people, but also lose your Boeing strategy around how you're showing up to deliver on what you're trying to achieve.
Actually, that brings up a really good question, Roberto, because you're talking about that, because I think the loyalty has really flown out the window over the past 30 years. I mean, if you think about what things were like, particularly in the 20th century, I mean, you would get a job with a certain company and your goal was to retire from said company.
Mad Men effect, yeah.
Yeah, you may or may not climb up the corporate ladder, however it is, but that was going to be your job. I think there's always a percentage of employees who they're never going to be all that engaged. They're in it for the paycheck. It's a job. They go to work. And that's always going to be a portion of your employee base, and that's fine. They do their job, they do it well, but there is no major loyalty. But there is that segment that does want to be loyal, that does want to have that connection and that commitment, even if they maybe only stay with the company for say 5 to 7 years, something along those lines. And I've always thought that employees are your single greatest advocates.
Always.
You want to tool them. I mean, when you think about if a crisis happens or they're an issue, I remember it was about 10, 15 years ago that IBM was one of the first to they allowed a certain number of their employees were trained to be able to answer on behalf of IBM in social media, which was unheard of at the time. Let's say this was probably around, say, 2013, 2014. Most companies had very strict social media policies at the time. Thou shalt never, answer or talk on behalf of the company, answer any questions about it, anything along those lines. And IBM pushed those boundaries a bit, and we're talking about no, 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 no. We trust our people. We were giving them the information. Nobody knows better than them. There are still parameters, the rules to play by. And I think it's really switched to that because, like I said, nobody's going to defend you more. Nobody's going to be your better advocate, and nobody's going to have more credibility than the people who actually work there. Not the leaders, the people boots on the ground who actually work there and are seen as doing the work. They are your most powerful voice. That is why that internal communications is so important because if they know that and they know it first, like I said, I always tell employees first, that was born during a crisis when it dawned on us that we didn't share something with employees before because we were responding, we were in that reactive mode, and it went out externally, and employees weren't prepared to be in the grocery store to talk with their neighbors who had questions about what they'd seen. And that's
Right.
something that we have got to give them the tools first.
Well, and Jen and Kateryna, you talked about the manager being that person who's the most important communicator to the team at the front line. But also it's the person who answers the phone for the customer who's communicating that. It's the person who shows up on site to do the job, deliver the package, etc., who is that external face of the company. And the other end of the day, what was it? With Kateryna, was it you who said it in our email thread earlier this week? People buy from people. And at the end of the day, you can see all the social media posts and all the ads and everything else as a consumer. But when that person shows up to your door and is very respectful, in my case, I have 5 kids, and they like hand the package to the kid who brings it to mommy, that's something you're going to remember as a customer.
That is what actually Roberta mentioned. Happy employees, happy clients. And
That's right.
yeah, so when we are building internal communications and when we are building corporate culture where employees feel seen and they feel they are important for the company, they feel like trust for the company, we can develop this belonging, this feeling of belonging with the company. And this feeling of belonging, it's increase performance and increase willing to advocate for the company. And we even have academic research studies who demonstrate numbers how loyal employees can advocate their organization in crisis situation. And that is what Jen mentioned recently. Yeah. So our job is not just inform employees. Our job is to make them feel seen, feel trusted, and feel like to make this
Empowered.
understanding of belonging with the organization. And that is like a power that we need to use to make external. By the way, about like external communications, they deliver message to customers, but we make this message live in our companies. And when employees believe in what we're talking about, like it means that it is easier to make for clients as well.
So,
Hearing you say that, I think one of the most powerful ways to motivate employees is to get an incredible article, sometimes in an incredible magazine or an article. People love it. Like, and actually, like, reflecting that back to you, like when internal comms and external comms aren't talking and they're kind of doing their own thing. But sometimes, like, even though like the New York Times headline didn't always move the other stakeholders, it might really move the employee stakeholders. And I've seen so many missed opportunities for like frame that, send that to everybody on the entire team and make them feel so proud to work there, but also make sure you're reflecting it through your intranet and like regurgitating it because people feel really proud to work for an organization that's in the media. And I think we've kind of lost that where it's like external is like, well, it's not really, this place is more important in terms of being able to reach this specific external audience. But actually, the internal audience from an external perspective is really important to be considered when you're looking at your overall stakeholder map. So I would implore internal comms people to like think about
I agree.
what's the external moment that could be a huge win that would make your internal audience like get really excited?
Oh, amen. I agree with that. And then take that a step further. And then when you promote that internally and share that, you then turn it and you share the link to that article. You encourage employees, hey, share this on your LinkedIn
Right.
post, share the feed,
Expand it.
engage.
Yeah.
We put there. In other words, you expand it, you use them as a net, I say use it, but take advantage of that network that you've got, of the pride that they want to feel, and that people want to show off. This is where I work. Look at what we do. How cool is this? So it really does come full
Well,
circle. And yeah, that relationship between internal and external, when it's working well, we can find those internal stories that I can then go to my external partner and be like, hey, listen, I
Yeah.
think we got something here that could really speak externally for you. They're thrilled. And then the same thing goes with them when they put out something external. Hey, listen, we think we need to share this through employees. It's a very great symbiotic relationship.
well, and it
Yeah,
goes
and
back to the, go ahead, Katerina, go
yeah,
ahead.
and I wanted to add that it is all about recognition. So we need to remember that if we want to influence behavior, our employees' behavior, we need to reward these behaviors that we need.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter, is it internal or external recognition? So is it like external newspaper or internal media or something like that? It is all about rewarding the behaviors that we need to achieve our
That's true.
goals.
Well, and two, again, as speaking from the public relations perspective, we call it the 3 Ts, the right topic at the right time from someone with the right title. But most often, the most compelling title is not see something. It's the person who has that. And we got a piece into Fox News for a client. It's this girl, she's 18, survived a car accident. She almost died. Her father held her neck while they got her on the ambulance. She had to learn how to talk and walk and everything again. The client's narrative was mentioned very briefly, but it was her personal story. And we wouldn't have known that if national people hadn't connected to the state people, and the state people hadn't said, she has a powerful story, talk to her.
Mhm.
And I think that's true in any time where you can, whether it's in the newsletter, the internally, Katerina, as you said, or Roberto, externally, if you can find, if your leadership is saying, go find those stories,
Mhm.
then I don't know. Again, I've never worked at a large organization, but that would excite me to say, man, I know I'm probably not going to be one of the 55 stories this year in a company of 40,000 people, but man, they really want to make sure it's not all about them and their big egos.
Mhm.
I think that is very exciting.
It is, and it's the stories that other employees love to hear too. That nobody, especially in a big organization, a multinational organization, it's so inspiring to hear, if you work in somewhere in EMEA and then you hear what's happening in parts of I'm talking corporate there. But let's say
Sure.
you're working in Poland and you hear stories of things that are happening, cool in Argentina and the company. It ties everybody together or makes you remember you're one company. And that's a really powerful part for employees as well. They're most excited hearing stories about other employees.
So we've hit our hour, and I know we were a little concerned not go for a full hour on this. This is a lot of fun. I don't think we covered half the agenda, but it was more fun that way. So I appreciate this, folks. I learned a lot. Let's close out with what is the greatest challenge and greatest opportunity for getting important narratives from the C-suite to the front lines, whether it's the customer externally or investors externally or employees internally. Greatest challenge, greatest opportunity. Roberto, kick us off.
Focusing on audience and having a narrative and a strategy. I don't know, that's challenge and that's opportunity for me.
Katerina?
I think the greatest challenge is to understand your audience, actually, to understand what do they want and how they feel and understand your information. And at the same time, probably it's the biggest opportunity because when you know what they want, it's the best way to deliver your strategy in the way they will understand it and they will implement it into their daily work.
Jen?
To getting out of their own way. That's what I'm saying with the C-suite is
I love that.
putting any egos aside and understanding that the best stories are the employee stories and the best leaders uplift and celebrate those employees. And then I think the biggest opportunity is along the same line is that embracing those stories of what's happening at the ground level and
Mhm.
elevating those. elevating those both internally and externally. That's how you build trust. That's how you build loyalty. That's how you build engagement, as Kateryna says. When employees and leaders feel like they're working together towards that common purpose, an organization is almost unstoppable.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for joining us, folks, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.